Well, a new poll has captured a growing sense of isolation in Canada when it comes to respect from other parts of the country and the relationship with the federal government. The survey done by the Angus Reid Institute provides some important insights for political parties as the election campaign nears. Let's take a look at the results with Shachi Kurl, the executive director of the Angus Reid Institute. She joins me now from Vancouver. Great to see you again.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
Look, take a moment to tell me about this series of surveys that you have been doing. What have you been up to?
Well, it's been a big project that we've been working on. Look, the issue of Western Canadian alienation or a sense of distance, as you know, isn't a brand new one. It's basically what started the ascent and the creation of the Reform Party back in the late 80s, early 1990s, which is the last time we looked at these issues. Now, today, the conversation is around pipelines, it's around carbon taxation, it's around equalization payments, and coming out of things like the First Ministers meeting in late last year, the convoys and the Yellow Vest movements we were seeing out of Alberta and the prairies, it just felt like time to look at this again. And Western Canada, in terms of population and in-migration and growth, is becoming more and more important. We're seeing increasing growth in the West, decreasing growth in Quebec and the Maritimes. And as a result, it felt like a good time to take a very deep dive at issues of federation, confederation, alienation, and even the S word, separatism.
Okay, let's dig into some of these numbers, some of these latest findings. When you canvass Canadians across the country and ask them how they feel they're being treated by the federal government, and that's really important in an election year, maybe more so than other years, what do you find?
Well, it's an interesting one. So what we find is that with the exception of one province, when we ask the question, do you feel that the federal government reflects and represents you and your province? The West definitely says no to that. Now, there are varying degrees of intensity around it. BC doesn't feel represented or reflected, but not nearly as much as Alberta and Saskatchewan feel sort of very much left out of the way the federal government reflects them back. And then in Manitoba, again, there's a dissatisfaction, but less intensity. Quebec and Atlantic Canada also don't feel like they are particularly well reflected and represented. And so what that leaves is one province that says we actually feel like we see ourselves in the federal government, and that is Ontario.
Let's drill down a bit and look at the views on how well Canadians believe their province is represented by national institutions. I thought that was really neat. It's not just, something called Ottawa. It's the government, it's the House of Commons, it's the Parliament, it's the Supreme Court. What are they saying?
Well, again, we see the same trends, the same patterns, perhaps a little bit less with the Supreme Court. But when it comes to Parliament, when it comes to media, particularly national media, when it even comes to the RCMP and policing, varying degrees of satisfaction. But again, a common theme or a common narrative across all of many of these institutions is that Western Canada does not see itself represented or reflected. That's certainly true, Peter, for news programming at the national level. So when we talk about national network programming, be it the CBC or be it the private broadcasters, folks in British Columbia, when we're talking about an issue that's important to all Canadians, don't necessarily see their point of view reflected there. That certainly goes for some of the other Western provinces as well.
You also wanted to know how people in different provinces feel they're viewed by the people in the rest of the country. So how do we feel about each other from province to province? And this is all about respect. What did you find?
Well, indeed, what we find again is that if there is one thing that holds the West together, it's not necessarily a sense of common values. It's not necessarily a sense of a particular connection to other Western provinces. Indeed, BC and Alberta have almost nothing in common. BC says it feels closer to Washington State and California than it does to Alberta. Alberta feels the same way about BC and feels much closer to Saskatchewan. So when we talk about the West, it's not just sort of one nebulous blob of four provinces kind of over there on the other side of Timmins and Sudbury. It is, in fact, four distinct provinces with some unique viewpoints on some of these issues. But to come back to it, if there is one thing that pulls all those four westernmost provinces together, it is a sense of the federal government and the rest of Canada doesn't respect us. We don't feel respected. And you see majorities in each province agreeing with that and feeling that.
And there are real pain points in the West in the relationship. And people in the West believe their treatment by the rest of the country and the federal government is getting worse. How bad?
Well, it's intensified over the last 28, almost 30 years. The first time Angus Reid looked at some of these issues was back in 1991. And so we do feel in Western Canada that these issues are worsening, that the feelings of alienation, lack of engagement, disrespect is worsening. Although I would note that is an increase in the trend, but it is not something so notable in that it's doubled or something like that. So it's up, but as part of a trend over time. What I don't have is a time machine to take us back, say, 15 years to the midpoint to see where Western Canada was at that point in time, unfortunately. But what we can say is, yes, it's worsening. It's worsening because of some of the issues we've laid out. Pipelines, carbon taxation, equalization payments, and this being an election year. You know, Peter, heaven help any national party leader that tries to take one message on the campaign trail and test it out in every different part of the country and expect to get the same reaction, because that is not going to happen. Westerners
believe theirs is a unique part of the country, and having traveled a lot of it, there's certainly lots to be said for that. When you put that question to Canadians across the country, what did you hear? Do they feel that the West is as unique as Westerners feel it is?
No, and the further you get from the geographic zone that is the four westernmost provinces, the less likely people are to be of the belief that the West is unique. So you don't necessarily see that in Quebec, for example. That view isn't necessarily as reflected in the Maritimes. So, Westerners themselves would say, look, we may not speak a different language, but we do have a distinct culture or cultures. We do have distinct outlooks on life. On the West Coast, we're facing the Pacific, we're facing Asia, not Europe. This causes differences in the way we approach issues and the way we approach matters in this country. Of course, Ontario and Central Canada has some sense, I think, that there is a uniqueness to Western Canada. Whether or not it's always agreed with or appreciated, of course, is another question.
Well, let's finish on this. I mean, as you read these, should we be concerned about a national unity issue? We always talk in this country about the need to celebrate what makes us different from from province to province. But it sounds like, in most ways, we're not seeing what's to celebrate about the differences. And in fact, people are feeling left out.
Well, that is the case. And frankly, Peter, anytime you get 10 first ministers together, you're going to see these differences highlighted. I think maybe it's why the previous Harper government didn't like having these types of meetings, because it brought all of this to the surface and to the fore. What I would say is this. Based on what we see, not just in this study, but studies of the values of Canadians and really sort of what makes us Canadian, we've been doing research on these types of issues for several years. We are a country that's bound together more by a handshake than a hug. And what I mean by that is it isn't necessarily a stirring patriotism about a concept of Canada or a notion of Canada that binds us together, because we have very different ideas around what Canada is, and that is borne out through the types of data we're seeing today. But the things that do bind us together are the desire to see better economic opportunities for ourselves, for our families, for our children, the idea that we can exist in a relatively not corrupt, peaceful country that respects and accepts the rule of law. You know, it sounds a little boring, but peace, order, and good government is a part of this. And of course, good is a relative term, but relative to a lot of other countries, we do have it good. That is what makes us Canadian.
All right. On that note, that'll bring our discussion to an end. Shachi Kurl from the Angus Reid Institute. Always good to talk to you. Obviously, more food for thought and lots to think about as, we get closer and closer day by day to a federal election vote in October of this year. Thanks again.
Thanks, Peter.